turning a destitute employee into a sexual hostage, trafficking her body to secure wrestling contracts, and in a grotesque display of absolute dominance, defecating on her before forcing her back to work. Yet the world revered this exact same man as a conservative billionaire patriarch, standing proudly beside his powerful politician wife. The explosive federal lawsuit shattered this terrifying paradox, exposing exactly why Vince McMahon's secret life was far more disgusting than anyone knew. Did his billion-dollar empire slowly create this monster, or merely provide the ultimate fortress for him to freely hunt? The genesis of this corporate pathology did not begin in a gleaming Connecticut boardroom. It began in 1945 in the dirt of a working-class trailer park in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Vincent Kennedy McMahon was not born into wealth, leverage, or any semblance of control. For the first 12 years of his life, he did not even bear the famous name of the wrestling dynasty he would later rule with an iron fist. He was known to the world simply as Vinnie Lupton. His biological father, Vincent James McMahon, a highly successful, wealthy, and respected regional wrestling promoter operating in the lucrative Northeast Territory, had abandoned the family when Vince was just an infant. Instead of inheriting a kingdom of sports entertainment, young Vinnie inherited a daily life defined by severe economic anxiety, and more crucially, violent domestic instability. He was raised by his mother, Vicky, and a rapid succession of stepfathers, in an environment where safety was a luxury they could not afford. The physical reality of this specific era became the origin of his fatal weakness. In rare, unguarded moments of public candor, most notably in a surprisingly dark 2001 interview with Playboy magazine, McMahon openly admitted to suffering severe, relentless physical abuse at the hands of one specific stepfather, a man named Leo Lupton. He described beatings so severe and so frequent that it instilled in him a permanent, altering psychological trauma. Behavioral analysts and criminal psychologists will consistently point out that a child who endures chronic, inescapable physical trauma and a complete, terrifying deprivation of personal agency often develops a highly rigid binary view of the world as a survival mechanism. In the damaged mind of the chronically abused child, humanity is strictly divided into two distinct, unchangeable categories. There are the predators who hold the power to inflict pain, and there are the victims who are helplessly forced to endure it. There is no middle ground, there is no mutual respect, and there is certainly no collaboration. This specific childhood trauma birthed an insatiable pathological need for absolute, unquestioned control. McMahon decided at a fundamental, deeply subconscious level that he would never again be the helpless variable in someone else's equation. He would become the absolute authority. He would dictate the physical, financial, and psychological reality of everyone who entered his orbit. Every ruthless television contract he later negotiated, every rival competitor he financially crushed into bankruptcy, and tragically, every vulnerable victim he allegedly cornered in his locked executive suite stems directly from the terrified boy in the North Carolina trailer park, desperately trying to build a world where no one could ever raise a hand to him again. Up to this point, this trauma is a familiar American tragedy of a broken home. But the plot twist arrives when this severely traumatized boy is suddenly handed the blueprint to acquire ultimate power, and that very survival habit, that need to completely dominate others to feel safe, will come back to ruin him and everyone who trusted him decades later. The trajectory of his life fractured completely and permanently at the age of 12. This was the year Vinnie Lupton finally met his biological father, Vince McMahon Sr., face to face. The psychological contrast for the boy was whiplash-inducing. While Vinnie was surviving a violent, impoverished reality where he had zero control over his own physical safety, his father was operating in an entirely different, almost mythical stratosphere. Vince Sr. was not just a businessman. He was a literal kingmaker. As the head of the Capitol Wrestling Corporation, which effectively monopolized the highly lucrative Northeast Territory out of New York City and Washington, D.C., Vince Sr. wielded immense, almost godlike power over his specific domain. He single-handedly determined which men became wealthy, adored superstars, and which men languished in painful obscurity in high school gymnasiums. He controlled the massive arenas like Madison Square Garden. He controlled the local television time, and he entirely controlled the narratives the public consumed. For a young boy starved of agency and desperate for security, witnessing this level of absolute, unquestioned authority was not just impressive, it was deeply intoxicating. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of the absolute control he so desperately craved to heal his childhood wounds. The professional wrestling business wasn't just a glamorous entertainment industry to young Vince, it was a psychological blueprint for total invulnerability. He instantly became obsessed, dedicating his entire being to entering his father's empire. However, Vince Sr., perhaps recognizing the brutal, unforgiving nature of the carnival-like underbelly of professional wrestling in the 1950s, did not want his son involved. He wanted Vince to have a respectable, stable, white-collar corporate life. He consistently and firmly pushed his son away from the squared circle, denying him entry into the inner sanctum. But this is exactly where we witness the first true alarming display of McMahon's defining and ultimately destructive personality trait. Beyond mere ambition, his defining trait was a terrifying, pathological inability to accept the word no. He viewed his father's repeated rejections not as a parental boundary to be respected, but as a temporary obstacle to be relentlessly, aggressively battered down until it broke. He refused to be denied. He shadowed his father at every opportunity. He quietly and intensely studied the hidden mechanics of the wrestling promotion. He acutely observed how his father manipulated the large, violent, and often desperate men on his roster through calculated financial leverage and subtle psychological pressure. He was meticulously absorbing the dark arts of human management, learning how to turn grown men into dependent assets. During this period, he also attended Fishburne Military School, a harsh, regimented environment that only served to further harden his worldview. The military academy reinforced his inherent belief in strict, unyielding hierarchies, the necessity of punitive discipline for any infraction, and the absolute, unquestioning submission of all subordinates to a singular commanding officer. By the time he graduated from East Carolina University in 1968 with a degree in business, his life's objective was completely locked in. He rejected a traditional white-collar life, fully determined to conquer his father's kingdom, whether his father wanted him to or not. After years of relentless badgering and wearing down his father's defenses, Vince Sr. finally relented. In 1969, he gave his son a small, struggling wrestling territory in Bangor, Maine, to promote on his own. It was largely intended to be a difficult test, perhaps even a deliberate setup for failure, to finally cure the young man of his obsessive infatuation with the wrestling business. Instead, Vince McMahon thrived in the chaos. He immediately applied his aggressive, unyielding, and deeply cynical personality to the local market. He quickly demonstrated a cold ruthlessness that made even the hardened cigar-chomping veterans of the old wrestling territory system incredibly uncomfortable. While his father and the other promoters of that era operated on a strict code of gentlemen's agreements, mutual respect for territorial borders, and handshake deals, Vince Jr. viewed the entire landscape as a brutal zero-sum game. In his mind, forged by the trailer park, if he was to win and be truly secure, someone else had to be completely and utterly eradicated. And this is where the foundational architecture of the future abuse allegations is quietly laid. He wasn't just learning how to promote predetermined wrestling matches in a small town in Maine. He was actively building the psychological and operational framework that would later allow him to view human beings as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. Whether they were rival promoters holding territory he wanted heavily concussed athletes desperate for a paycheck, or eventually highly vulnerable female employees needing a job to survive, he was learning how to identify leverage, exploit weakness, and demand total capitulation. He was learning how to commodify human desperation. The stage was rapidly being set for a hostile takeover, not just of his father's regional company, but of an entire global industry. The traumatized, powerless boy from North Carolina was finally being handed the keys to the castle, and he was about to lock the gates behind him. The professional wrestling industry in the 1970s operated under a rigid, almost feudal structure. The landscape was entirely controlled by a cartel known as the National Wrestling Alliance, or the NWA. The United States was carved up into roughly 30 distinct regional territories. A promoter in Texas did not run shows in Florida. A promoter in Minneapolis did not broadcast his television programs in Chicago. It was a closed system, a legally questionable monopoly operating on handshake agreements, unwritten codes of honor, and a strict mutual respect among the territory bosses. Vince McMahon Sr. was one of the most powerful lords in this system, controlling the incredibly lucrative Northeast Corridor through his Capital Wrestling Corporation. This was the world young Vince McMahon formally entered in 1969 when he was dispatched to Bangor, Maine. He was supposed to be an apprentice, learning the time-honored traditions of his father's peers. Instead, he operated like a spy behind enemy lines. While the older generation of promoters saw the NWA cartel as a stable, gentlemanly agreement that ensured everyone made a comfortable living, Vince McMahon viewed it as a fundamentally flawed, highly vulnerable system. He analyzed the handshake agreements not as signs of mutual respect, but as gaping operational weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Up to this point, the wrestling business was a chaotic carnival. McMahon decided it needed to be a corporate monolith. The trauma of his childhood had instilled in him a permanent anxiety. He could not tolerate a world where his success or failure depended on the goodwill or gentlemen's agreements of other men. He required absolute, legally binding control. During this apprenticeship period in the 1970s, we also witnessed the construction of his most effective and enduring public shield. In 1966, he had married Linda Edwards. As McMahon began moving up the ranks of his father's company, Linda was entirely integrated into the operational machinery. While Vince was the aggressive, hyper-masculine force driving the live events and television production, Linda became the stabilizing corporate anchor. She handled the finances, the intricate legal structures, and the administrative back end. In 1980, they officially incorporated Titan Sports, initially headquartered in Massachusetts. This was not a subsidiary of his father's company. It was an entirely separate corporate vehicle. This partnership is a critical piece of the prosecution's evaluation of how power is exercised. The presence of Linda McMahon provided a veneer of traditional white-collar legitimacy to a business that was historically viewed as a seedy, lower-class hustle. She was articulate, highly educated, and presented the image of a respectable, conservative businesswoman. This dynamic, the ruthless, boundary-pushing husband, completely insulated by a respectable, legally astute wife, would become the foundational architecture of the WWE. It was the exact same corporate structure that, decades later, would allegedly be utilized to process millions of dollars in non-disclosure agreements to silence victims of sexual abuse, keeping the dark reality completely hidden behind a wall of corporate bureaucracy. The definitive turning point, the moment The Apprentice initiated the hostile takeover, occurred in 1982. Vince McMahon Sr. was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The Patriarch of the Northeast Territory was dying, and the future of the Capital Wrestling Corporation was entirely uncertain. A traditional son in a family business might expect a clean inheritance, a passing of the torch to secure the family legacy. But the transaction that occurred was entirely devoid of sentimentality. It was a cold, highly leveraged corporate buyout. Vince McMahon, using his own entity, Titan Sports, purchased the Capital Wrestling Corporation from his dying father and his father's minority partners, including industry veterans like Gorilla Monsoon and Arnold Scotland. The mechanics of this contract are essential to understanding McMahon's psychology. He did not have the liquid capital to buy the company outright. Instead, he structured a high-risk deal involving a series of strict quarterly balloon payments. The terms of the contract were absolute. If McMahon missed a single payment, the entire ownership of the company would instantly revert back to his father and the other partners, and Titan Sports would forfeit everything it had paid up to that point. By structuring a high-risk deal, he voluntarily placed extreme financial pressure upon himself to achieve total dominance. He was operating on a knife's edge, entirely dependent on maximizing revenue immediately. To meet those crushing quarterly payments, he had to squeeze every single dollar out of the existing Northeast Territory, relentlessly pushing the limits of the live event schedules and television syndication. He was learning how to operate under severe self-inflicted duress, prioritizing immediate financial extraction above all other considerations, including human relationships. Before the sale was finalized, Vince Sr. extracted a solemn promise from his son. He made the younger McMahon swear that he would respect the unwritten rules of the NWA cartel. He demanded that his son stay within the borders of the Northeast Territory and absolutely never compete with the other regional promoters, many of whom were Vince Sr.'s lifelong friends and business associates. Vince McMahon looked his dying father in the eye and agreed to those terms. He lied. The ink on the Titan Sports contract was barely dry, and his father was barely in the grave in 1984 before McMahon aggressively and systematically broke every single promise he had made. He immediately took the television programming that was highly successful in New York and began buying up local television syndication slots in other promoters' territories across the country. He broadcast his shows in Chicago, in Florida, in Texas, directly invading the markets of the men his father had called friends. When the local promoters called to protest, relying on the old handshake agreements and codes of honor, McMahon ignored them. He was not interested in coexisting. He was interested in a monopoly. More aggressively, he began a relentless campaign of talent poaching. The territory system relied on local stars staying relatively loyal to their home promoters. McMahon used the revenue he was generating in the Northeast to offer massive, exclusive written contracts to the biggest stars in every other region. His most significant and devastating acquisition was convincing a massively popular wrestler named Hulk Hogan to abandon the Minneapolis-based AWA territory and join Titan Sports. He didn't just take Hogan, he took the top broadcasters, the best behind-the-scenes producers, and the most lucrative arena contracts. He was utilizing a predatory business model. He would enter a local market, outspend the local promoter on television advertising, steal their main event talent, and deliberately run opposing live events on the exact same nights to financially bleed his competitors dry. He weaponized capital. Dozens of historic multi-generational wrestling companies were completely eradicated within a span of 3 years. Promoters who had been in the business for 50 years were forced into bankruptcy, their livelihoods completely destroyed by a man who refused to acknowledge any operational boundaries. This period of ruthless expansion perfectly illustrates his fatal weakness. His childhood trauma demanded absolute control, and in the business world, that translated to the total annihilation of any potential rival. He viewed the financial ruin of the other promoters not as an unfortunate byproduct of competition, but as a necessary and deeply satisfying confirmation of his own power. He had successfully rewritten the rules of reality for an entire industry. He learned that loyalty was a liability, gentlemen's agreements were for the weak, and highly structured, legally binding contracts were the ultimate weapons. He learned that if you control the paychecks, you completely control the people, and that very habit, the weaponization of contracts and the absolute commodification of human capital, will come back to ruin him later. The same legal aggressiveness he used to crush rival promoters in 1983 would eventually evolve into the suffocating non-disclosure agreements he allegedly used to silence Janelle Grant and other victims decades later. Until the mid-1980s, his behavior, while ruthless, remained confined to standard, albeit cutthroat, corporate warfare. He was destroying businesses, not bodies. But as his monopoly solidified and his wealth exploded, the protective shield around him grew impenetrable. He was no longer just a promoter, he was becoming an untouchable billionaire. And the transition from corporate predator to alleged human trafficker was quietly beginning to take shape under the guise of sports entertainment. By the mid-1980s, the ruthless corporate warfare was largely over. Vince McMahon had successfully dismantled the multi-generational territory system, outspending and outmaneuvering his father's former colleagues. But as his television syndication footprint expanded into a truly national coast-to-coast operation, he immediately collided with a vastly more powerful opponent. He was no longer just fighting rival promoters for ticket sales. He was suddenly fighting the statutory framework of the United States government. Across the country, every individual state possessed a state athletic commission. These were rigid, bureaucratic government bodies designed to regulate boxing and, historically, professional wrestling. They demanded licensing fees for every performer, mandated the presence of state-appointed ringside physicians, and, most crucially, they extracted a heavy percentage of the live gate revenue as a tax on legitimate sporting events. For decades, the old promoters had simply accepted this taxation as the inherent cost of doing business. They paid the state, maintained the strict public illusion that wrestling was a genuine, unscripted athletic competition, a concept known in the industry as kayfabe, and absorbed the financial hit. Vince McMahon, however, viewed the state athletic commissions not as regulatory bodies, but as financial parasites. His childhood trauma had hardwired him to reject any external authority that attempted to impose limits on his resources or his actions. He was now operating a national touring company. Paying sports taxes in all 50 states was actively bleeding millions of dollars from his bottom line. He needed a mechanism to completely bypass the government. And this is where we witness a masterclass in legal manipulation that perfectly answers our evaluation rubric regarding how power is exercised. The issue wasn't simply that he wanted to evade taxes. The issue is the breathtakingly cynical method he engineered to do it. McMahon decided to commit the ultimate heresy in the wrestling business. He decided to publicly admit that the entire industry was a fabrication. In a highly calculated legislative maneuver, culminating most visibly in a 1989 hearing before the New Jersey State Senate, McMahon and his legal team actively lobbied to have professional wrestling completely deregulated. He stood before state legislators and legally declared that his product was not a sport at all. He argued it was an exhibition, a predetermined performance, a script executed by trained acrobats. He successfully coined and weaponized the term sports entertainment. The legal argument was extraordinarily simple but devastatingly effective. If the outcome is predetermined, it is theater, not a sport. Therefore, it falls outside the legal jurisdiction of the athletic commissions. It is exempt from their licensing fees, exempt from their medical mandates, and entirely exempt from their sports taxes. This was a massive, unprecedented legal victory. By simply redefining the vocabulary used to describe his business, he saved his corporation millions of dollars annually overnight. But the psychological impact of this victory on McMahon's developing pathology was far more profound than the financial windfall. This is a crucial data point in understanding the monster he would allegedly become. He learned that reality is malleable. He realized that if you have enough money, enough lawyers, and enough audacity, you can literally rewrite the legal definitions of your own actions, and the government will legally sanction your behavior. The state stepped aside and allowed him to operate with zero regulatory oversight. McMahon had successfully manipulated the United States legal system, carving out a bizarre legal exemption that made his specific kingdom exempt from the rules governing everyone else. he was building a statutory fortress of absolute authority. While his legal team was dismantling state regulations, McMahon was simultaneously betting the entire financial existence of his company on a single massive cultural event. In 1985, he launched WrestleMania. Up to this point, wrestling was still largely confined to smoky arenas and late-night local television. McMahon envisioned a pop culture spectacle, blending his massive cartoonish wrestlers with mainstream celebrities like Mr. T, Cyndi Lauper, and Muhammad Ali. The financial leverage required to produce the first WrestleMania was staggering. McMahon took every asset he possessed, including the mortgage on his own home, and poured it into securing closed-circuit television feeds across the country. If WrestleMania failed, Titan Sports would be bankrupt, and McMahon would be financially ruined. This highlights a terrifying aspect of his everyday personality, his absolute pathological appetite for existential risk. He was completely comfortable operating on the precipice of total disaster because in his mind, total dominant victory was the only acceptable outcome. WrestleMania was a colossal paradigm-shifting success. It transformed his top star, Hulk Hogan, into an American icon, a red, white, and blue superhero preaching vitamins and prayers to millions of children. But the glaring dramatic contradiction lies in the terrifying gap between the vibrant, family-friendly product presented on television and the dark, highly exploitative reality of the labor force that physically produced it. As the company's profits exploded into the hundreds of millions, the men taking the physical damage in the ring were actively being stripped of their basic labor rights. This brings us to the most important corporate weapon McMahon ever devised, a legal classification that sits at the very core of the eventual trafficking and abuse allegations, the independent contractor loophole. Under McMahon's strictly enforced corporate policies, professional wrestlers were not classified as employees of the company. They were legally designated as independent contractors. The mechanics of this classification are vital to understand. In a standard corporate environment, if a company demands that you wear a specific uniform, report to a specific location at a specific time, dictates exactly what you say, and strictly prohibits you from working for any other competitor, you are, by law, an employee. And as an employee, you are entitled to health insurance, retirement pensions, paid time off, and the company assumes legal liability for your workplace injuries. McMahon constructed a system that demanded absolute 100% behavioral and physical control over his performers, but legally absolved his corporation of any responsibility for their well-being. He owned their character names, he owned the intellectual property of their likenesses, and he dictated a grueling, physically destructive touring schedule that often required performers to wrestle 300 days a year. Yet because they signed contracts classifying them as independent contractors, the wrestlers were forced to pay for their own travel, their own rental cars, their own hotel rooms, and most devastatingly, their own health insurance. The physical reality of this policy was brutal. If a 300-pound athlete suffered a severe spinal injury in a ring in Detroit on a Tuesday night, McMahon's company was not legally obligated to pay for his surgery or his rehabilitation. Because of the independent contractor clause, McMahon's company was not legally obligated to pay for his surgery or his rehabilitation. If the wrestler couldn't perform, he he simply wasn't paid. The athlete was instantly rendered a disposable asset. To survive this unforgiving system, to avoid losing their spot on the lucrative television broadcasts, wrestlers began masking their severe injuries. They drove hundreds of miles through the night between towns, heavily reliant on a dangerous cocktail of prescription painkillers, muscle relaxants, and anabolic steroids, just to maintain the massive vascular physiques McMahon demanded, and simply to physically walk to the ring the next night. This labor structure illuminated his true pathology. His insatiable need for control resulted in a business model of total domination with zero mutual obligation. He viewed the athletes not as human beings or corporate partners, but as expendable commodities. They were raw materials to be fed into the grinding machinery of his television production. When a body broke down, it was discarded and immediately replaced with another desperate athlete willing to sign away their labor rights for a chance at television fame. He had engineered a closed ecosystem where he extracted all the wealth and all the loyalty, while successfully offloading all the physical and financial risk onto the workers themselves. And this is exactly where the foundation for the grotesque abuse allegations of 2024 was firmly poured. The independent contractor model wasn't just a tax-saving strategy. It was a psychological conditioning mechanism. It established a deeply entrenched corporate culture where human beings were legally defined as disposable, where the power dynamic was so overwhelmingly skewed toward the CEO that basic human rights were routinely overridden by the signature on a contract. McMahon was training his entire corporate structure to accept the absolute commodification of human bodies. He learned that he could use contracts to isolate people, strip them of their leverage, and force them to endure physical and psychological damage in exchange for a paycheck. Throughout the late 1980s, his manipulation of the law and exploitation of human capital were entirely financial and physical. He was breaking bodies in the wrestling ring, not behind locked office doors. The public saw only the booming success, the sold-out stadiums, and the soaring profits. The government had completely backed away, accepting his definition of sports entertainment. The shield around him was seemingly impenetrable. He had built a billion-dollar empire by aggressively pushing the boundaries of legal and ethical behavior, and society had rewarded him with massive wealth and cultural influence. He truly believed he had outsmarted the system. But the plot twist arrives precisely when you believe you are untouchable. His hubris had blinded him to a critical vulnerability. He had successfully convinced the state athletic commissions to stop looking at his business. But by the early 1990s, the severe chemical reality of his locker room could no longer be hidden, and the federal government of the United States was about to step into his kingdom, threatening to tear his entire empire to the ground. The physical reality of the professional wrestling locker room in the early 1990s was a ticking time bomb. The massive, vascular, cartoonish physiques marketed to millions of children during the 1980s boom were heavily subsidized by a rampant, unchecked culture of anabolic steroids. McMahon had engineered a highly specific predatory ecosystem. Because his independent contractors were terrified of losing their spot on television and had no union or guaranteed health care to protect them if they took time off to heal, chemical enhancement became an unspoken mandatory requirement for employment. You either maintained the superhuman aesthetic the boss demanded, or you were quickly replaced by someone who would. For years, this chemical supply chain was quietly facilitated by a man named Dr. George Zahorian, a urologist who was ironically appointed by the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission to ensure the health and safety of the wrestlers. Instead of regulating the performers, Zahorian became the locker room's primary dealer, selling massive quantities of steroids directly to the talent, often right out of his medical bag in the arena hallways. When the federal government finally caught up with Zahorian and convicted him of drug distribution, in 1991, the protective fortress McMahon had built around his empire began to crack. The federal prosecutors did not stop at the doctor. They followed the money, they followed the supply chain, and they aimed their sights directly at the absolute top of the Titan sports hierarchy. In November 1993, the unthinkable happened. The United States Department of Justice formally indicted Vincent Kennedy McMahon on charges of conspiracy to distribute steroids to his roster of wrestlers. The man who had spent his entire adult life building a world where he possessed absolute, unquestioned control was suddenly stripped of all his leverage. He was facing federal prison time. The government intended to seize his assets, dismantle his company, and permanently remove him from the throne he had violently taken from the old territory promoters. This is a critical juncture in evaluating his everyday personality and his fatal weakness. For the first time in his professional life, McMahon was forced into a defensive posture against an entity significantly more powerful than himself. He could not buy out the Department of Justice. He could not force the federal government to sign a non-disclosure agreement. He was entirely at the mercy of a jury. The trial took place in the summer of 1994 at a federal courthouse in Uniondale, New York. During the trial, his physical appearance shifted dramatically. The brash, aggressively confident billionaire was completely absent. Instead, McMahon arrived at the courthouse every single day wearing a highly visible, restrictive, orthopedic neck brace. He claimed it was due to a recent spinal surgery, but in the theater of the courtroom, the visual impact was undeniable. The neck brace physically projected vulnerability, frailty, and a subtle, calculated bid for sympathy from the jury. The man who marketed indestructible superheroes was deliberately presenting himself as a broken, harmless, middle-aged executive being bullied by an overreaching federal government. It was a masterful, cynical manipulation of his own physical image to survive. The prosecution's case hinged entirely on proving that McMahon was not just a user of steroids, but an active distributor who conspired with Dr. Zahorian to illegally supply his independent contractors. The government believed they had the ultimate silver bullet to secure a conviction, the testimony of Hulk Hogan, the very creation that McMahon had used to build his global empire. The prosecution granted Hogan total immunity in exchange for taking the stand and testifying against his former boss. The entire industry held its breath, expecting the star witness to deliver the fatal blow to Titan Sports. But the plot twist occurred precisely when the government felt most confident. When Hogan took the stand, he admitted to his own extensive steroid use, and he admitted that he would pick up packages of drugs alongside his paychecks at the corporate headquarters. However, under intense cross-examination by McMahon's elite, highly expensive defense team led by attorney Laura Bravetti, Hogan stated that McMahon had never explicitly ordered him to take the drugs, nor had McMahon directly sold them to him. The government's star witness had effectively neutralized the core of the conspiracy charge. The prosecution failed to establish the definitive, documented link that proved McMahon was the architect of the distribution ring, rather than just a negligent executive turning a blind eye to the reality of his locker room. On July 22, 1994, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges. Vince McMahon walked out of the federal courthouse a free man, but the psychological consequence of this acquittal is perhaps the single most important factor in understanding the horrific allegations that would surface exactly 30 years later in 2024. The issue isn't just that he avoided prison. The issue is the terrifying lesson he internalized from the experience. McMahon did not view the acquittal as a narrow escape or a warning to clean up his corporate governance. Because of his fundamental trauma-induced need for absolute dominance, he processed the not guilty verdict as a total, validating victory. He had looked the United States federal government in the eye, he had deployed his massive wealth to hire a superior legal team, and he had won. He defeated the highest authority in the land. This permanently warped his perception of risk and consequence. It solidified a deeply dangerous hubris. He fundamentally believed that his money and his lawyers could construct a shield so strong that it could deflect the Department of Justice. If he could beat the federal government on conspiracy charges, he subconsciously concluded that he was entirely untouchable. He was above the law, the rules of society, the boundaries of basic morality, and the legal constraints that governed other corporations simply did not apply to him. However, while McMahon had survived the legal guillotine, his corporation was bleeding to death. The negative public relations generated by the steroid trial were catastrophic. The family-friendly facade of the 1980s was completely shattered. The public now viewed his product as a toxic, drug-infested, highly dangerous environment. Television ratings plummeted, live event attendance cratered, and crucial corporate sponsors began fleeing the brand in droves. The company was on the verge of total financial collapse. McMahon desperately needed to rebuild the public trust, and he needed a pristine, unassailable figurehead to do it. He could no longer be the face of the company's corporate governance. Here we witness the strategic, brilliant, and ultimately deceptive deployment of his political shield. In 1993, right as the federal indictment was looming, Vince McMahon officially elevated his wife, Linda McMahon, to the position of president and CEO of the corporation. This was not merely a symbolic gesture. It was a highly calculated crisis management strategy that perfectly answers our rubric regarding how power is exercised. The contrast between the product in the ring and the woman in the boardroom was intensely dramatic. While the wrestling product was inherently violent, chaotic, and aggressively male-dominated, the official corporate entity was now legally operated by a soft-spoken, highly articulate, conservative mother of two. Linda McMahon became the ultimate corporate sanitizer. She was deployed to speak with Wall Street bankers, to negotiate with nervous television executives, and to sit in front of hostile congressional committees. She initiated aggressive public charity campaigns, forging deep, highly publicized partnerships with organizations like the Make-A-Wish Foundation and various literacy programs. The corporate contradiction was jarring. The company was actively running a labor model that stripped its own performers of health insurance and treated their bodies as disposable, while the CEO simultaneously stood in front of cameras, handing out giant novelty checks to children's charities. Linda McMahon provided a veneer of traditional, maternal, white-collar legitimacy that effectively camouflaged the ruthless, hyper-masculine dictatorship her husband was operating behind the scenes. She built a firewall of corporate respectability. Whenever journalists or politicians attempted to criticize the morality of the wrestling business, they were forced to debate a polished conservative businesswoman who spoke fluently about shareholder value and corporate responsibility. The public perception entirely shifted. The media began to view the McMahons not as carnival promoters, but as a fascinating American success story. A brilliant, slightly eccentric husband paired with a steady, highly competent wife. They were the ultimate power couple, navigating the treacherous waters of the entertainment industry together. But the lawsuit filed in 2024 alleges that this entire arrangement, this carefully curated image of a unified family business, was fundamentally a strategic illusion. The prosecution's evidence suggests that the family values shield, constructed in the mid-1990s, was the exact architecture used to maintain the silence decades later. The corporate structure that Linda McMahon legitimized to the public would allegedly become the same closed-loop system that processed the secret NDAs, utilized company funds to hide sexual misconduct, and allowed the chairman to operate a ring of exploitation entirely, completely undetected by the public markets. By 1997, the company had stabilized financially, largely due to the impenetrable corporate facade Linda had constructed. But behind the walls of his headquarters, Vince McMahon was experiencing a profound psychological shift. He had beaten the federal government, he had survived financial ruin, and his wife had successfully rebuilt his public credibility. He felt invincible. And he realized something incredibly dangerous. The steroid trial had nearly destroyed him, but it had also made him the most famous, talked-about man in the industry. He learned that controversy, even negative controversy, generates massive attention. And in his world, attention could be monetized. He no longer needed the family-friendly, cartoonish heroes of the 1980s. He decided to lean entirely into the darkness. He made a conscious, highly lucrative decision to strip away the final lingering remnants of the old wrestling traditions and embrace a product based entirely on violence, overt sexuality, and extreme moral ambiguity. Up to this point, his ruthless, dictatorial personality was kept hidden behind the curtain, a secret known only to the wrestlers and the corporate executives. But the plot twist is in the year 1997. He realized that the monster the government tried to expose wasn't a liability. It was his greatest asset. And this is where things really get dirty, because Vince McMahon was about to step out from behind the curtain, grab a microphone, and introduce the world to the very monster he had been hiding all along. In the aftermath of the federal steroid trial, Vince McMahon realized a dark, highly profitable truth about the American public. He realized that they did not demand moral purity from their billionaires. They merely demanded to be entertained. The government's attempt to expose him as a ruthless, manipulative operator had not destroyed his aura, it had weaponized it. In 1997, facing severe financial pressure from a rival promotion, McMahon made a conscious, calculating decision to completely blur the line between his actual corporate ruthlessness and his television product. He stepped out from behind the curtain, grabbed a microphone, and officially introduced the world to Mr. McMahon, an exaggerated, sociopathic, tyrannical billionaire boss who derived immense, visible pleasure from psychologically and physically tormenting his employees. The issue here is not that he played a villain on television. The issue is the terrifying psychological and corporate environment this television persona created in reality. For over a decade, spanning the late 1990s and into the 2000s, McMahon utilized his global television platform to broadcast extreme, highly normalized workplace degradation. He wrote storylines where he forced female employees to strip to their underwear, where he commanded male executives to literally kiss his bare buttocks in the center of the ring to keep their jobs, and where he forced a female talent to get on her hands and knees and bark like a dog. The public consumed this as outrageous, boundary-pushing satire, a hallmark of what the company branded the Attitude Era. But behavioral analysts looking at the later allegations suggest a far more sinister reality. This was not just entertainment. It was a public testing ground. It was a massive live-action psychological conditioning experiment. If the CEO of a publicly traded company can successfully condition his audience, his shareholders, and his own human resources department to accept the extreme public humiliation of his staff as a standard business practice, he effectively erases the baseline of acceptable corporate behavior. He was training his entire workforce to understand that extreme degradation was simply the price of admission to his empire. The boundary between the scripted sadism of Mr. McMahon and the actual unchecked pathology of Vincent Kennedy, McMahon evaporated. He was hiding his true nature in plain sight, masking his profound psychological defects under the convenient, highly lucrative guise of performance art, and Wall Street rewarded him for it. In 1999, the company went public. The initial public offering flooded Titan Sports with hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid capital. McMahon was instantly elevated from a wealthy wrestling promoter to an institutionalized, untouchable American billionaire. He now possessed the financial resources to outspend any legal threat, silence any accuser, and completely insulate his private obsessions. As the 2000s bled into the 2010s, the architectural shield around him reached its absolute impenetrable peak. His wife, Linda McMahon, successfully transitioned from corporate CEO to mainstream political powerhouse, eventually being appointed by President Donald Trump to serve in the presidential cabinet as the administrator of the Small Business Administration. With Linda residing in Washington, D.C., heavily protected by the aura of the federal government, Vince McMahon was left completely alone at the absolute pinnacle of his corporate pyramid in Stamford, Connecticut. The board of directors was heavily stacked with his own family members, loyal executives who owed him their entire livelihoods, and close friends. There was no oversight committee. There was no internal mechanism capable of saying no to the chairman. He was a king operating in a total terrifying vacuum of accountability. This absolute power creates a severe psychological danger. When a man whose foundational childhood trauma demands absolute control is finally granted a world where no one can ever challenge him, the appetite for domination does not subside. It mutates. It searches for new, increasingly transgressive frontiers. Controlling the television scripts and the stock price was no longer enough to satisfy the void. The absolute authority he wielded in the boardroom needed to be translated into absolute physical and psychological ownership of a human being. Up to this point, his ruthlessness had been largely confined to corporate warfare and the exploitation of independent contractors in the wrestling ring. But in the spring of 2019, the macro history of his corporate empire violently contracted into a micro, devastating reality. The billionaire predator finally identified the perfect, entirely vulnerable target. Her name was Janelle Grant. She was not a corporate climber looking to exploit a billionaire. By the spring of 2019, she was in a state of profound, debilitating freefall. According to the federal lawsuit filed in 2024, she was a woman in a state of profound, debilitating freefall. She was residing in the same highly exclusive luxury apartment building in Connecticut as Vince McMahon, but her reality was fundamentally different. She was suffering from severe, paralyzing grief following the rapid, consecutive deaths of both of her parents. The emotional devastation was compounded by a catastrophic financial crisis. She was unemployed, her savings were entirely depleted, and she was facing imminent eviction from her home. She was, by every psychological and financial metric, completely defenseless. It was precisely here that the alleged mechanism of human trafficking and predatory isolation was initiated. McMahon, acutely aware of his surroundings, noticed the grieving woman in his building. The prosecution's narrative emphasizes that a normal corporate executive, upon seeing a neighbor in such severe distress, might offer basic charitable assistance or direct them to a standard human resources portal. But McMahon, guided by the predatory instincts honed over decades of corporate warfare, allegedly saw something else. He saw extreme leverage. He recognized a human being whose survival needs were so acute that her boundaries could be easily, systematically dismantled. The initial approach was a masterclass in psychological grooming. He did not immediately reveal the monster. He presented himself as the benevolent patriarch, the exact opposite of the terrifying television character he played. He offered her a fresh start. He began with the calculated deployment of his immense wealth, utilizing expensive gifts, private dinners, and a mesmerizing display of his influence to rapidly manufacture a false sense of trust and security. For a woman drowning in grief and debt, the sudden, intense attention of one of the most powerful men in the world was highly disorienting. He was positioning himself not just as a neighbor, but as her sole savior. He was actively isolating her from any remaining support systems by making her entirely dependent on his goodwill. The trap was formally set when he offered her a position at the WWE corporate headquarters. The job title was strictly administrative, a legal assistant in the company's legal department. The promised salary was $75,000 a year. To Janelle Grant, this was not just a job offer, it was a literal lifeline. It was the promise of medical insurance, the ability to pay her rent, and a desperate chance to rebuild a shattered life. She accepted the position, But the federal lawsuit alleges that this employment offer was entirely fraudulent. It was a legally documented mirage designed to physically lure her into his controlled environment. The $75,000 salary was not compensation for administrative work. It was the purchase price for a human being. The physical and psychological transition on her very first visit to the WWE corporate headquarters was immediate and terrifying. She arrived expecting to sign standard human resources paperwork. Instead, she was bypassed around corporate protocols and directed straight into the chairman's sprawling private executive suite. The architecture of his office is crucial here. It was designed to project overwhelming, intimidating power. As she stepped inside, the lawsuit details a terrifying, immediate shift in reality. The benevolent neighbor vanished. The heavy oak door of the executive suite swung shut, and then there was the distinct, undeniable sound of the lock clicking into place. In that single chilling moment, Janelle Grant was physically trapped. The illusion of the corporate job interview evaporated. The lawsuit alleges that McMahon, utilizing his massive physical presence and the terrifying weight of his corporate authority, immediately dropped the facade of the savior. He allegedly commanded her to remove her clothing. When she froze in terror and confusion, the psychological conditioning he had perfected over decades was instantly deployed. He did not merely threaten her physically, he threatened her entire existence. He coldly, explicitly tied her financial survival, her continued employment, and the total destruction of her future to her immediate, absolute sexual submission. And this is where the timeline crosses the threshold from corporate manipulation into alleged criminal depravity. She was no longer a neighbor, and she was certainly not an employee. She was a hostage trapped in a billion-dollar corporate fortress. The man who had spent his childhood surviving physical abuse in a trailer park had finally engineered a scenario where he possessed absolute, terrifying life-or-death control over another human being. The door was locked, the board of directors was blind, and the grotesque, systematic dismantling of Janelle Grant was about to begin. The sound of the heavy oak door locking inside the Stamford headquarters was the definitive sound of a corporate trap snapping shut. The federal lawsuit outlining the years 2019 through 2021 does not describe standard workplace harassment. It describes a completely closed ecosystem of total, inescapable coercion. Janelle Grant was physically inside the nerve center of a publicly traded company, surrounded by hundreds of employees, human resources professionals, and corporate attorneys. Yet she was simultaneously isolated on a desolate, terrifying island where Vincent Kennedy McMahon was the only governing authority. The stark physical reality of her daily existence revealed how absolute power operates when all external constraints are removed. Her official desk was located directly outside McMahon's private suite. She was situated precisely where she could be monitored, summoned, and controlled at a moment's notice. The lawsuit alleges a grueling, terrifying routine. McMahon would regularly summon her into his office, lock the door during standard business hours, and subject her to extreme sexual demands, while executives paced the hallways outside discussing television ratings, licensing deals, and stock fluctuations. The chairman of the board was allegedly inside his suite, stripping a financially destitute woman of her basic human autonomy. This presents a dramatic, terrifying contradiction. The WWE was heavily marketed as an entertainment brand built on the concept of ultimate physical empowerment. Muscular athletes overcoming impossible odds were broadcast to millions of homes globally. Yet, the literal epicenter of this empowerment brand, the CEO's office, was allegedly operating as a highly efficient windowless facility for human subjugation. If she attempted to resist, the conditioning he had established on day one was immediately weaponized. He did not need to shout. He simply had to remind her of her severe financial reality. He held the power to terminate her employment, which, given her profound debt and recent bereavements, equated to total ruin. His lifelong obsession with absolute control was now backed by the lethal leverage of a billion-dollar payroll. The allegations detail a systematic escalation of degradation. It was not enough for McMahon to simply extract sexual compliance. His specific psychological pathology required the active, visible destruction of her dignity. This is where the behavior crosses the line from severe harassment into outright sadism. The lawsuit claims that McMahon frequently forced Grant to use various degrading implements during these encounters. However, the critical detail, the detail that exposes the true architecture of his mind, is that he allegedly demanded these devices be named after his own professional wrestlers and corporate executives. The psychology behind this specific demand was profoundly twisted. By forcing his victim to refer to instruments of her own sexual degradation by the names of the men he employed, McMahon executed a dual domination. He was physically violating Janelle Grant while simultaneously, symbolically, asserting his absolute ownership over his male workforce. In his deeply warped perception of reality, he was the absolute master of the entire corporate universe. Every person under his payroll, whether they were a multi-million-dollar television star or a terrified legal assistant, was merely an object to be manipulated, humiliated, and utilized for his exclusive gratification. It was a physical manifestation of the omnipotence he had sought his entire life. The most disturbing allegation in the federal lawsuit crosses the line from physical abuse into the total, clinical erasure of another person's humanity for the sake of momentary amusement. The lawsuit pinpoints the month of May 2020. During an encounter at McMahon's private residence, which allegedly included the active participation of another high-ranking WWE executive, McMahon committed an act of supreme, calculated defilement. The prosecution's document states that McMahon subjected Janelle Grant to a grotesque, humiliating act of extreme physical degradation. This was not an accident. This was the ultimate physical expression of reducing a human being to the status of a toilet. The lawsuit alleges that after committing this act, McMahon coldly raked his fingers through the mess, rapped her on the head, and casually walked out of the room. He then issued a direct, horrifying command. She was strictly forbidden from showering. She was ordered to put her clothes back on and continue her work for the company while remaining in that soiled, degraded state. Executing that sequence of events, then smoothly transitioning back into the role of a corporate billionaire, required a chilling, profound lack of empathy. He did not view her as a person experiencing trauma. He viewed her as a completely broken mechanism that had successfully fulfilled its designated humiliating function. The corporate shield he had built over 40 years, the legal teams, the political connections of his wife, the aggressive public relations, had successfully insulated him so thoroughly that he believed he could commit an act of absolute sociopathic depravity and face absolutely zero consequences. And for a terrifyingly long period, he was entirely correct. But the mechanism of his control did not stop at his own personal gratification. The lawsuit alleges a further massive escalation that transitions this case from a horrifying personal abuse scandal into a federal human trafficking conspiracy. If Janelle Grant's body was an asset owned by Vince McMahon, he soon realized that this asset could be traded, leveraged, and utilized to grease the wheels of his commercial machinery. He began to systematically commodify her. By 2021, the dynamic shifted from private domination to corporate currency. The lawsuit points directly to a critical business negotiation involving one of the company's most lucrative and heavily promoted athletes, former UFC heavyweight champion Brock Lesnar. At this time, Lesnar was an independent contractor, and his massive multi-million-dollar contract with the WWE was up for renewal. He was reportedly hesitant to sign a new deal, withholding his signature to increase his leverage. Faced with a standard corporate negotiation, a normal CEO would deploy financial incentives, offer stock options, or promise better television exposure. Vince McMahon, according to the federal complaint, allegedly deployed Janelle Grant. The lawsuit claims that McMahon explicitly directed Grant to produce highly explicit, personalized sexual content and deliver it to Lesnar. McMahon allegedly told Grant that her body, her explicit images, and the promise of future sexual access were part of the negotiation strategy to secure the athlete's signature on the contract. When the chief executive officer of a publicly traded company uses the body of a subordinate female employee as a bargaining chip to secure a commercial contract, it instantly ceases to be a workplace dispute. It is the textbook, statutory definition of sex trafficking. He was using the resources of Titan Sports, the corporate email servers, the executive leverage, the promise of continued employment to facilitate the exchange of a human being for a commercial signature. The woman who was initially hired under the guise of a $75,000 legal assistant had been entirely reduced to a signing bonus. This commodification required complicity. McMahon could not operate a corporate trafficking ring entirely on his own. He needed enforcers. He needed individuals within the corporate hierarchy who understood the grim reality of his actions and actively participated in maintaining the silence. The lawsuit identifies several co-conspirators, but none more crucial or dramatic than John Laurinaitis. John Laurinaitis was not a low-level manager. He held the title of Head of Talent Relations. In the unique architecture of the professional wrestling business, the Head of Talent Relations is effectively the Director of Human Resources for the entire performing roster. He was the man responsible for the health, safety, and contractual well-being of the workforce. If an employee was being harassed, abused, or exploited, John Laurinaitis was the exact designated corporate officer they were supposed to report to for protection. The drama-filled contradiction here is staggering. The lawsuit alleges that the head of human resources was not just aware of the abuse, he was actively participating in it. He was allegedly a co-abuser, present in the hotel rooms, present in the executive suites, and actively engaging in the sexual exploitation of Janelle Grant alongside the CEO. By corrupting the very mechanism designed to protect employees, McMahon ensured that Grant had absolutely no internal avenue for escape or report. The entire corporate safety net was completely compromised. Furthermore, the lawsuit alleges that McMahon actively shared the explicit, non-consensual images and videos of Grant with a wide network of individuals within the company. This allegedly included members of the technical production staff, television producers, and other high-ranking executives, totaling at least 12 different individuals. At first glance, this seems like an incredibly reckless action for a billionaire trying to hide a crime. Why distribute the evidence of your own depravity? But analyzing this through the lens of a prosecutor examining a criminal enterprise, a highly strategic, terrifying logic emerges. It is a psychological tactic frequently utilized by organized crime syndicates. By sharing the illicit material, McMahon was distributing the guilt. He was initiating his subordinates into a cartel of complicity. If an executive views the material or participates in the degradation, they are now legally and morally compromised. They can never report the chairman to the authorities or the board of directors, because doing so would instantly implicate themselves. McMahon was weaponizing shame to bind his top lieutenants to him permanently. It was a digital blood oath, securing their absolute loyalty and their absolute silence, ensuring that the king could never be overthrown from within. Up to this point, the system functioned perfectly. The trauma of the victim was absolute, the complicity of the executives was secured, and the public shield maintained by the political connections of his wife remained entirely intact. The currency of his control was fear, leverage, and human flesh, but a closed ecosystem built entirely on extreme extortion is inherently volatile. The psychological toll on Janelle Grant was reaching a fatal breaking point. Her physical health was deteriorating, her mental state was shattered, and the walls of the corporate fortress were finally beginning to close in. In the winter of 2022, the mechanics of his control had to shift. The currency of flesh was no longer sufficient to maintain the silence. The currency had to become cash, and that transition, the arrogant, clumsy attempt to put a financial price tag on a shattered human life, would be the exact mechanism that triggered his ultimate destruction. By the winter of 2021, the closed, highly controlled ecosystem that Vince McMahon had meticulously constructed inside the WWE headquarters was beginning to fracture. The currency of his control, fear, psychological leverage, and the systematic degradation of Janelle Grant was no longer sufficient to maintain the absolute silence he required. According to the federal lawsuit, Grant was reaching a catastrophic breaking point. Her physical health had severely deteriorated, and her psychological state was completely shattered by nearly 3 years of alleged sexual exploitation and trafficking. She was no longer just a compliant victim. She was becoming a highly volatile liability sitting directly outside the chairman's office. McMahon, utilizing the cold, calculating instincts that had allowed him to eliminate rival promoters decades earlier, recognized that the physical trap was failing. He needed to transition from psychological coercion to legally binding financial suppression. He needed to deploy the ultimate weapon of the modern billionaire, the non-disclosure agreement. In January 2022, McMahon explicitly ordered Janelle Grant to resign from the company, but resignation was merely the first step of the erasure. He presented her with an NDA. The terms outlined in the subsequent lawsuit were stark and absolute. In exchange for her complete permanent silence regarding everything she had endured behind the locked door of his executive suite, McMahon agreed to pay her $3 million. This document was not a peace treaty, and it was certainly not an act of restitution. It was a heavily weaponized legal gag order. It was a mechanism designed to legally purchase a human being's trauma and lock it in a vault forever, backed by the terrifying threat that if she ever spoke a word of the truth to anyone, his elite legal team would financially annihilate her. For a woman who had originally been lured into his orbit by severe financial desperation, the threat of being sued into oblivion by a billionaire was absolute, paralyzing leverage. Grant signed the agreement. The trap seemed perfectly executed. McMahon had successfully utilized his vast personal wealth to completely sanitize his operational environment. He had allegedly commodified her body, traded her to secure talent contracts, and finally purchased her silence, all while sitting comfortably at the apex of a publicly traded company. The protective shield of his wealth and his corporate structure had functioned exactly as designed, but the architecture of this cover-up contained a fatal, highly arrogant flaw. McMahon's insatiable need for total dominance meant that he fundamentally could not respect any boundary, not even the boundaries of a contract he had drafted himself to save his own life. The $3 million payment was not structured as a single lump sum. It was scheduled in installments. McMahon paid the initial $1 million, and then he simply stopped paying. This is perhaps the most defining, irrational, and terrifying action in the entire timeline. Why would a man whose net worth hovered around $3 billion, a man for whom $2 million is a literal rounding error, deliberately breach a contract that was the only thing preventing him from being exposed as an alleged human trafficker? The prosecution's analysis suggests it was an act of supreme, unchecked hubris. He did not withhold the money because he couldn't afford it. He withheld the money because he firmly believed he was entirely untouchable. He evaluated Janelle Grant and concluded that he had broken her so thoroughly and terrified her so completely that she would never dare to challenge him, even if he openly defied the agreement. He viewed the unpaid balance not as a legal breach, but as a final permanent assertion of his absolute ownership over her reality. He believed the rules of cause and effect simply did not apply to Vincent Kennedy McMahon. That arrogance triggered the beginning of his total destruction. While McMahon felt entirely secure in his Stamford fortress, the digital trail of his actions was quietly unraveling. In June 2022, the Wall Street Journal dropped a massive investigative report. The journalism did not just expose the $3 million agreement with Janelle Grant. It uncovered a decades-long pattern of behavior. The reporting revealed that McMahon had spent over $12 million in various hush-money settlements over the past 16 years, silencing multiple women who had alleged sexual misconduct and infidelity. The impenetrable shield had finally cracked, and the exposure came from the very financial markets he had manipulated to build his wealth. The immediate corporate reaction perfectly highlights the dramatic contradiction between the public company and the private dictatorship. For decades, the WWE Board of Directors had operated largely as a rubber stamp for McMahon's desires. It was heavily populated by his family members, loyal executives, and individuals whose financial security was entirely dependent on his favor. But the publication of the Wall Street Journal article forced them into a corner. They could no longer pretend they didn't know. Facing immense pressure from institutional investors and the terrifying specter of public liability, the board was legally obligated to hire an outside law firm to launch an independent internal investigation into the chairman's conduct. But the most dangerous entity to enter the arena was not the Internal Investigative Committee. It was the federal government of the United States. And this is a crucial, fascinating twist in the narrative of corporate accountability. When the federal authorities initially mobilized against McMahon in the summer of 2022, they were not strictly investigating the allegations of sexual abuse or human trafficking. They were investigating bookkeeping. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, alongside federal prosecutors, launched inquiries based on a rigid violation of corporate law. When the CEO of a publicly traded company pays millions of dollars in hush money to suppress scandals that could negatively impact the company's stock price or his own employment status, those payments are legally considered corporate expenses. Even if McMahon used his own personal bank accounts to pay the women, federal law dictates that these transactions must be officially recorded on the company's ledger because they materially benefit the corporation. McMahon had deliberately hidden over $12 million in expenses from his own shareholders. To the federal government, this was not just a moral failing. It was the falsification of financial records. It was securities fraud. Nearly 30 years after he walked out of the federal courthouse in New York, having defeated the Department of Justice in the steroid trial, the government had returned. And this time, they weren't arguing about the hazy definitions of performance-enhancing drugs. They were holding a mathematically precise ledger of missing millions. McMahon found himself entirely surrounded. The media was relentlessly digging into his past. Federal subpoenas were being issued to his executives, and his own board of directors was actively investigating him. The pressure became unsustainable. On July 22, 2022, Vince McMahon posted a brief, stunningly casual message on social media announcing his immediate retirement from the company he had built. The industry breathed a collective sigh of relief. The narrative seemed perfectly resolved. The monster had finally been caught, and rather than face a humiliating public execution, he had been quietly and permanently ushered out the back door. His daughter, Stephanie McMahon, and a trusted executive were installed as co-CEOs. The company's stock price actually surged as Wall Street celebrated the removal of the toxic liability. The corporate machine seamlessly moved on without its creator. But anyone who believed Vince McMahon would quietly accept defeat fundamentally misunderstood his pathology. He did not know how to surrender. Exile for a man addicted to absolute control is a fate worse than prison. For 5 months, McMahon sat in isolation, watching his daughter and his former subordinates successfully run his empire without him. He watched the public celebrate his absence. The perceived humiliation was absolute, and his response was a masterclass in ruthless, scorched earth corporate warfare. In late December 2022, McMahon initiated his counterattack. The board of directors, believing they had permanently excised the cancer, received a letter from the exiled chairman. he declared his immediate intention to return to the company. The board, to its credit, unanimously replied with a firm rejection, stating that his return would be catastrophic for the company's reputation, its shareholders, and its ongoing federal investigations. They essentially told the founder that he was no longer welcome in his own house. This is the exact moment McMahon deployed the ultimate mechanism of his power. He did not need their permission. Due to the specific highly consolidated financial architecture he had established when he took the company public in 1999, McMahon still personally controlled over 80% of the company's Class B voting power. He was not just a shareholder. He was the absolute sovereign of the voting bloc. He issued a terrifying ultimatum to the board. If he was not immediately reinstated as executive chairman, he would use his voting power to unilaterally veto any future television rights negotiations or any potential sale of the company. Focus on the severity of that threat. The WWE's multi-billion-dollar television contracts with networks like Fox and NBC Universal were approaching expiration. If McMahon vetoed those deals, the company's primary revenue stream would instantly evaporate. He was literally holding the financial survival of a publicly traded corporation hostage. It was a billionaire's version of a murder-suicide pact. He explicitly informed the board that he would actively destroy the company's future if they did not allow him to rule it. He had stripped away all pretenses of corporate governance and fiduciary duty. It was a raw, unadulterated display of brute force. The board of directors immediately surrendered. They had no legal mechanism to stop him. In January 2023, Vince McMahon forced his way back into the WWE headquarters. He immediately fired several dissenting board members and replaced them with his own loyalists. His daughter, Stephanie, abruptly resigned from the company entirely a few days later. McMahon was back on the throne. The hostile takeover of his own empire was complete, but he knew the federal investigations were still circling, and he knew his position remained highly vulnerable. He needed a permanent structural solution to insulate himself from any future attempts to remove him. He initiated the final, most massive corporate transaction of his life. In April 2023, he shocked the financial world by announcing that he had agreed to sell the WWE to Endeavor, the massive talent agency and parent company of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. The deal merged WWE and the UFC into a new $21 billion publicly traded sports and entertainment conglomerate named TKO Group Holdings. To the public and to Wall Street, this was heralded as a genius business maneuver. McMahon had successfully cashed out at the absolute peak of the company's valuation. But analyzing this through the lens of a prosecutor, the merger was the ultimate defensive fortification. By selling the company and folding it into a much larger corporate entity run by powerful Hollywood executives, McMahon effectively dismantled the very WWE board of directors that had tried to exile him. He secured a seat on the newly formed TKO board of directors, ensuring he remained at the absolute pinnacle of the new hierarchy, protected by the massive legal and financial resources of Endeavor. As 2023 drew to a close, Vincent Kennedy McMahon believed he had executed the greatest escape in corporate history. He had survived the Wall Street Journal leak. He had crushed a rebellion by his own board of directors. He had executed a multi-billion-dollar merger, and he remained a dominant executive force in global sports. He had utilized every weapon in his arsenal: his voting shares, his ruthless negotiating tactics, and his sheer terrifying audacity to completely reestablish his absolute control. The Shield was rebuilt stronger than ever before. But as he sat in the new gleaming corporate boardroom of TKO Group Holdings, congratulating himself on his invincibility, the fatal flaw in his architecture remained entirely unaddressed. He had beaten the executives and he had manipulated the market. But he had forgotten about the $2 million he had arrogantly refused to pay. He had forgotten about the woman he had allegedly broken and discarded. Janelle Grant was financially ruined, her physical health was severely compromised, and her career was destroyed. But because Vince McMahon had broken his own non-disclosure agreement, she was no longer legally bound to her silence. The billionaire had successfully fortified his castle against the armies of Wall Street and the federal government, completely unaware that the victim he had locked in the basement was currently drafting a 67-page federal lawsuit that was about to burn his entire empire to the ground. On January 25, 2024, the illusion of his invulnerability was permanently shattered. Janelle Grant officially filed her lawsuit in the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut. It was not a vague summary of workplace grievances. It was a 67-page forensic autopsy of a billionaire's depravity. It bypassed his internal corporate security, bypassed his public relations firm, and bypassed the loyalists on his former board of directors. It went directly into the permanent, unsealable public record. The document contained highly specific time-stamped text messages, agonizingly detailed accounts of sexual violence, and the explicit identification of the corporate resources allegedly used to facilitate human trafficking. The exact text messages where McMahon allegedly demanded explicit content to secure the Brock Lesnar contract were printed in black and white for the entire world, and more importantly, for federal prosecutors to read. The immediate corporate reaction to this lawsuit exposes the final, ultimate truth about how power is exercised at the highest levels of global capitalism. McMahon had spent 40 years believing he was the apex predator of the corporate world. He had successfully bullied rival promoters, crushed labor unions, and strong-armed television networks. He believed his new partnership with Endeavor and the creation of TKO Group Holdings had provided him with an impenetrable fortress, but he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the entity he had merged with. Endeavor was not a professional wrestling company operating on the carny logic of the old territory days. It was a mainstream, multi-billion-dollar Hollywood and sports conglomerate, heavily reliant on blue-chip corporate sponsors. And in the modern corporate ecosystem, moral outrage is only actionable when it threatens the bottom line. Less than 24 hours after the lawsuit became public, the financial dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Slim Jim, a massive longtime corporate sponsor of the WWE, abruptly announced it was completely pausing its promotional activities with the company, effective immediately, specifically citing the disturbing allegations against the chairman. Other major sponsors immediately began signaling their intent to follow suit. This is the moment the math fundamentally changed for the executives at TKO. McMahon was no longer the undisputed kingmaker. He was a highly toxic radioactive liability, actively destroying their revenue streams. The board of directors at TKO did not need an internal investigation. They did not need to wait for a trial. They simply looked at the fleeing sponsors, looked at the plummeting public relations metrics, and executed a ruthless, swift decapitation. On January 26, 2024, just one day after the lawsuit was filed, Vincent Kennedy McMahon officially resigned from his position as executive chairman of TKO Group Holdings. He was stripped of his seat on the board of directors. He was stripped of all creative control. He was completely and entirely exiled from the very empire he had violently built over 4 decades. There was no grandiose farewell speech in the center of the ring. There was no final display of the Mr. McMahon character. He issued a sterile, legally mandated statement vehemently denying the allegations, claiming the lawsuit was replete with lies and fabricated instances, and then he vanished. The heavy oak door of the corporate suite had finally been locked from the outside, and he was not holding the key. The physical reality of his current existence is a stark, punishing contrast to the absolute authority he wielded just months prior. He was subsequently forced to sell off the vast majority of his remaining stock in TKO, completely severing his financial leverage over the company. The organization he founded is currently undergoing a massive systematic campaign to actively erase his existence from their corporate history. His name is banned from television broadcasts. His image is scrubbed from promotional materials. The wrestlers he created no longer speak his name. He has suffered the ultimate modern execution, a complete and total social death. He is a man trapped in isolation, watching his legacy be dismantled piece by piece by the very executives he once commanded. But social exile is the least of his immediate threats. The fatal flaw of his arrogance, his refusal to pay the final $2 million of the non-disclosure agreement, has unleashed the full, unmitigated weight of the United States federal government. In the wake of the civil lawsuit, the Department of Justice significantly escalated its criminal investigation. This is no longer merely a probe into the improper bookkeeping of hush money. The federal authorities are actively investigating allegations of sex trafficking and sexual assault. Federal agents executed a search warrant on McMahon's personal phone and issued grand jury subpoenas to multiple individuals within his former corporate inner circle. The billionaire is now in his late 70s, physically frail, recovering from massive spinal surgeries, and waiting in absolute paranoia for the potential of a sweeping federal criminal indictment that could spend his final years in a federal penitentiary. We do not end this investigation by simply declaring Vincent Kennedy McMahon a devil. To do so would be intellectually lazy, and it would completely absolve the systems that allowed him to operate for so long. He did not emerge from the ether as a fully formed monster. He is the direct, catastrophic product of severe, untreated childhood trauma that was subsequently rewarded, subsidized, and heavily weaponized by unchecked corporate capitalism. The traumatized boy from the North Carolina trailer park learned that physical dominance was the only way to avoid being a victim. American corporate culture then handed that boy $1 billion, an army of lawyers, and a global television platform, effectively telling him that his darkest, most sociopathic instincts were not just acceptable, but highly profitable. His true legacy is not the creation of WrestleMania. It is not the global expansion of sports entertainment, nor is it the multi-billion-dollar television contracts. His legacy is the shattered reality of Janelle Grant and the unknown number of other victims legally bound by the millions of dollars in non-disclosure agreements he dispersed over 2 decades. His legacy is the independent contractors whose bodies were broken and discarded without medical insurance to fuel his television ratings. His legacy is a corporate culture that was so thoroughly corrupted by fear and complicity that a human being could allegedly be trafficked down the hall from the Human Resources Department without a single executive raising an alarm. If it weren't for his terrifying absolute inability to accept the word no, the landscape of modern entertainment would look vastly different. But it was that exact same flaw, his hubris, his arrogance, and his absolute refusal to honor the boundaries of the silence he had purchased, that ultimately triggered his destruction. Vincent Kennedy McMahon built a world where he was the only author of reality, entirely insulated from consequence. But reality eventually breaches every fortress. He leaves behind a sprawling, highly profitable corporate empire, but the foundation it rests upon is a profound, unpayable moral debt. History, in its relentless prosecution, will not remember him as the visionary who conquered an industry. It will remember him as the monster who was finally crushed beneath the weight of his own impenetrable shield. The fallout continued long after his forced resignation. A $1.7 million settlement with the SEC could not close the federal ledger. The Department of Justice actively tightened the noose. In 2025, a federal appeals court pierced his attorney-client privilege, giving a grand jury direct access to the hidden mechanics of the cover-up. Emerging legal filings further allege that a secret, internal door was structurally built into the corporate floor plan to facilitate the exploitation. By early 2026, the silence McMahon had spent millions to purchase was permanently broken. Janelle Grant publicly confirmed her cooperation with federal authorities. At 80 years old, the man who once demanded absolute physical and psychological submission sits in total isolation. His legacy is fully rewritten. He is not just crushed by his own shield, he is trapped beneath the rubble of his corporate fortress, awaiting the final verdict of the law.